Today we are going to be looking at Chapter 5, Section 2, the Powers of Congress. As you go through and listen to the lecture, make sure you fill in the notes page that you've been given in Google Classroom and make sure that you submit it for a grade when you finish. Anything that's on the PowerPoint that's in red, please make sure that you put that into your notes. Make sure you submit it for a grade when you finish. You're welcome to pause the video at any time to make sure that you get what you need to get, and then turn this in for a grade when you finish. Then there should be an assignment afterwards that you will do. Okay, so let's begin. The first question we want to consider today is, what types of power does Congress have? There are three types of powers. They have expressed powers, they have implied powers, and they have inherent powers. Now, expressed powers are powers that are specifically stated in the Constitution. That's one of your vocabulary words, so you should make sure you know that. But expressed powers are powers that are specifically stated in the Constitution. They can coin money. They can collect taxes. Those are expressed powers, and the Constitution says they can have them. Implied powers are powers that are only suggested by the Constitution. They're implied by the Constitution. Some call that the necessary and proper clause, because the Constitution gives those powers and then the express powers, and then says do anything necessary and proper for carrying out those express powers. So those would be implied powers. Something like creating the IRS to collect the taxes. That would be an implied power because it's not in the Constitution. They can do that. Okay. And inherent powers are powers that are just naturally their power because they are a government. All governments have these particular powers. Most of these powers have to do with foreign affairs and excuse me, and controlling borders and dealing with other countries and things like that. But they're just things that are not in the Constitution, not even implied in the Constitution, but just naturally a power that a government has because it's a government. Okay, so number two, what are the expressed powers of Congress? What are these specific things that are expressed in the Constitution? Now, this does not list them all, but the assignment you have, you will go through and look at each of the expressed powers of Congress. So they can do things like financing, they can coin money, they can borrow money, they can create different things like that related to it. Commerce would be trade. They're authorized to control trade between the states and between the United States and foreign countries. Defense related, they are to maintain an army and a navy. They are to provide for the common defense, etc. And there are other powers designated to aid the creation of a national economy or safeguard national sovereignty. Sovereignty would be our own authority, our own power. So those are the express powers of Congress. And like I said, you'll go through and look at them in detail in your assignment for this set of notes. Now, the sub-question under number two, the first one is, what was the purpose of the 16th Amendment? That was to allow Congress to levy an income tax, because in the Constitution, it does give them the power to tax, but it has to be proportion based upon each state's population. And that is very difficult to do. And so in the late 1800s, they had passed an income tax law, but the Supreme Court ruled that that was unconstitutional. So in the early 1900s, I believe it was in 1912, 1913, somewhere around that time, they ratified the 16th Amendment, which allows Congress to levy an income tax. So we have that amendment to thank for paying income taxes to the United States government. The second sub-question is, how has the Commerce Clause been used to expand the powers of Congress? And that's a very interesting question, because most of what Congress does these days, they put it under the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause says that they can regulate interstate commerce. Now, interstate means between one state and another. Intrastate would be within the state. So technically, the Constitution only empowers Congress to regulate trade from one state to another, but not within a particular state. Okay? But that clause has been so broadly interpreted by the Supreme Court. You see where I have SC there, that means Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has ruled that businesses operating exclusively within a state still have an effect on interstate commerce, allowing Congress to pass laws regulating commerce within states. So, for instance, there was a Supreme Court case in the 1960s, in 1964, where there was a motel in Atlanta that did not want to desegregate. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 required businesses doing business with public to desegregate. Well, they didn't want to do that. And so they said that because we are a hotel or motel in a particular city, that we don't have to follow that law because we're not part of interstate commerce. Well, the Supreme Court ruled that the availability of motel rooms affected interstate travel of truckers. So therefore, even though they were a business operating specifically within the city of Atlanta and the state of Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled that because that they could affect interstate commerce, therefore they could be regulated by this clause. So these rulings that are similar to that have given the Supreme Court broad authority. I mean, the Congress broad authority to regulate commerce even within a state. The third sub-question on this one is, how has Congress tried to limit the president's ability to fight wars without congressional approval? Now, remember, the president is the commander-in-chief of the military, but one of the expressed powers of Congress is that they would raise the money, that they would, collect the taxes that would then fund the military. So their responsibility is to fund the military, to create the military, et cetera. But only Congress can declare war. That's an express power. President does not have power to declare war. But after the Vietnam War was over, the Congress decided that the president needed less power to just do whatever he wanted to do militarily. So they passed in the mid-1970s a law called the War Powers Resolution, and it limits the president's abilities to use troops in combat without congressional approval. In other words, if they're going to do something, even if it's not a declared war, this law requires that they go to Congress and get approval first. And if it's an emergency situation, then they have a certain amount of days that they have to then come to Congress and ask for approval after the action has started. Now, President Nixon vetoed that law, but Congress overrode his veto. It's one of the few times in history that there's been an override, but it was overridden. Every president has declared that this law is unconstitutional, and every president has been accused of breaking this law since then. So that's interesting, and it still has not been adjudicated in the Supreme Court. So I don't know if it ever gets to the court how that will rule or how it will come out. My personal opinion is that it's probably not constitutional because president is the commander-in-chief, but the Congress has the power of the purse. Therefore, if they don't like what he's doing, they can just cut off his funds. That's their ability. Okay. And the fourth sub question under number 2 is, what is the militia called today? Because much of what is written in the Constitution about defense has to do with a militia. In other words, a volunteer military that is not fully, not the regular army. So what is that called today? Today we call that the National Guard. And so when you see in the Bible, I'm sorry, I don't know why I said the Bible, in the Constitution about the militia, what it's referring to is the National Guard, because that's what we call it today. Now, the states generally are overseeing the National Guard, but Congress is given the express power to help fund them, help train them, help house them if they're needed in a national situation, because the president has the expressed authority to call them into active duty if he needs to. So normally the militias are in each state, but then the president can call them to active duty, in which case the Congress then must provide for their training and equipping and things like that. All right, number 3, what are the implied powers of Congress? These are powers that allow Congress to take action needed to carry out the express powers. Okay, so anything like that. Now, how did Thomas Jefferson's view of the necessary and proper clause contrast with that of Alexander Hamilton? And here you see a basic debate that has gone on in our country from the time of its founding and the time of its Constitution, which was ratified in 1789, until today. Now, today it's less intense in the debate on this issue than it was then, and it's a lot less well defined than it was then. But basically, Jefferson held what's called a strict constructionist view. A strict constructionist says that Congress only has the power to do what is specifically or stated or expressed in the Constitution. So that's what a strict constructionist is. Alexander Hamilton held a loose constructionist view, which meant that not only could they do what was expressed, but if the Constitution didn't say they couldn't do it, then they were allowed to do so. So that's a loose construction. Now today, like I said, it's much more convoluted in the debate, and so it's not as clearly defined. But you still see people who are more strict in their view of the Constitution. You see some people who are loose in their construction constructionist view of the Constitution. Generally speaking, among our political parties today, the Republicans would be more strict constructionists. The Democrats would be more loose constructionists. Now, if you want to look at the Libertarian Party, which is not a very big party, but there are libertarians in both the Democrat and Republican Party, they tend to be very much strict constructionists, almost in the vein of Thomas Jefferson, which you don't see much today other than them. So anyway, that's something that you make sure you need to know is about the strict and loose constructionist views of the Constitution. Why is the necessary and proper clause called the elastic clause? It's called the elastic clause because it allows the government and Congress specifically to expand its power, much like elastic on a pair of sweatpants. Okay. Now, what are some of Congress's non-legislative powers? Now, legislative means lawmaking. Okay. So what are some of its non-legislative powers? They can conduct investigations. In fact, they have what's called oversight. In other words, they oversee various laws and things they have implemented to make sure that they're being implemented correctly. They have oversight over the executive branch to make sure that there is not any corruption there, to make sure it's doing its job like that. They can oversee things and actions of the courts if there's any corruption there. If no candidate receives a majority of electoral votes, the House of Representatives will actually choose the president and the Senate would choose the vice president. That has not happened since 1824, so it's unlikely that it's going to happen anytime soon. There's not been a third-party candidate that's garnered enough electoral votes to keep someone from getting a majority since then. So they would have that power. That's non-legislative. The Senate also approves treaties or ratifies treaties that the president makes with other countries, and they confirm presidential appointments such as Supreme Court justices, other judges, ambassadors, members of their cabinet, and other officials. What is a subpoena? A subpoena is a legal document requiring a person to testify in a certain matter. So sometimes Congress will be doing oversight, and they'll be conducting investigations. And what they'll do is they will issue a subpoena to someone that will require that person legally to show up and testify before that committee or before Congress. And if they refuse to do that, then they can turn that over to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General could then pursue charges because it is illegal to defy a subpoena. Now, most people get subpoenas in court, from courts, not from the Congress. Most of us are never going to go before Congress. But they have that power, and that is a non-legislative power where they can force someone to come and testify. Now, the person can always plead the fifth or something like that, not actually answer much questions, but that is something they can do. What is the congressional sequence for impeachment? Now, impeachment and removal is another very important power of Congress. It's one that generally, historically, has not been used very often. But what you need to understand is that when someone is impeached, that does not mean they are removed from office. That does not mean they lose their power or their authority. Impeachment is simply when the House of Representatives votes to file charges on them. And basically, it brings up charges for some issue, okay? And so with a very simple majority vote, the House of Representatives can impeach a president, a Supreme Court justice, another judge, or other officials that are in office. And so they can do that with a simple majority vote. Once that happens, then it goes to the Senate, and the Senate would put on a trial for the impeached person. Once that trial is concluded, then they can convict and remove from office if they have a 2/3 majority vote in the Senate. Now, we've had 3 presidents impeached by Congress, by the House. We've had Andrew Johnson, we've had Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. But none of them have received the 2/3 majority vote in the Senate that led to their removal. So they've not been removed. We've had some justices and judges removed, impeached and removed, but that's it. Next question, what are some limits on the powers of Congress? Separation of powers. So remember, powers are divided between the branches of government. So they don't have all power or all authority, and that's a limit on their power. You have the executive and the judicial branch, which have powers as well. Then there are constitutional sections that deny certain powers to Congress. Okay. And then you have clauses in the Constitution, particularly in the Bill of Rights and other amendments, that protect civil rights and liberties like the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to keep and bear arms. The Fourth Amendment, no unreasonable search or seizure or illegal search or seizure, things like that. And number 6, how has the power of Congress changed during U.S. history? It has grown as Congress has expanded its activities. Now, it grew particularly in the 1910s under Woodrow Wilson, and it also grew under Teddy Roosevelt as well in the early 1900s. But Franklin Roosevelt expanded the powers of Congress even more when he was president. I mean, he didn't do it himself, but it happened during his reign. And it also expanded greatly during the time of LBJ and then during the time of President Obama. Okay, but they've enacted things like Social Security, unemployment insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, and many, many other programs that until the 1900s, there was no idea that the government even had the authority to do that. All right, that should be everything. Make sure that you have submitted your notes, and when you're done, make sure you do the assignment that is in Google Classroom for you. Let me know if you have any questions.